The Theory of Methods unit could really have been called a crash course in data collection. Now, I've already talked about how research methods have two basic phases, data collection and data analysis, and what we're going to be focusing on this semester is data analysis. But a good analysis needs to be at least somewhat mindful of where the data that they're using come from. So that means we need to understand a little bit about our data sources, how we come by data, and what's involved in putting together a really good data collection process. I'm breaking this unit up into 4 videos. In this first video, we will talk about what are data and how are data structured. In the second video on operationalization, we'll talk about how we turn a concept of interest into something we can actually measure. In the third video on generalizability, we'll talk about how we know whether our data can reliably speak to some population of interest. And then in the fourth video, which I'm calling Where Data Come From, we'll talk about some common data collection techniques. So what are data and how are data structured? Let me start with a note on grammar. You may be hearing me say what are data instead of what is data. And that might sound a little bit weird to you at first. That's because we are used to using the word data incorrectly. The word data is actually plural. The singular form is datum, or datum, depending on how you prefer to pronounce it. But the word data is plural, and so it would be kind of like saying there is computers. It doesn't make sense. You don't use the singular form of a verb with the plural noun. We would say there are computers. Just as we would not say there is data, we would say there are data. I know that may seem like a very nitpicky kind of thing to focus on, but language matters, especially as we're thinking about how we collect our data. So I want you to get yourselves in the habit of thinking of the word data in the plural form and checking yourself on it when you use it in writing. What I like to do sometimes, if I'm not entirely sure, is use the example I just gave. I will substitute the word computers, plural, in place of data. And if the sentence doesn't make sense anymore, then that means I have to fix it so that it does, and then I can put the word data back in. But if I say it with the word computers, and it does make sense, we're probably good to go. So use that as a rule of thumb anytime you're writing the word data. It might sound a little bit weird to you at first, but trust me, you're in the better position doing it that way. The unit of analysis is the whom or the what being studied. We most often think of individuals as the unit of analysis because as we're starting off a project and we're thinking about doing a survey or interviews or something like that, it is individual people that we usually are directly interacting with. And many studies are built off of individuals as the unit of analysis. But it doesn't have to be individuals. There are plenty of other levels that we could look at for our units of analysis. We could, for example, consider organizations. And this could be anything from corporations, to churches, to universities. We could consider groups, such as households, cities, or things like that. We could even consider relationships and interactions as a unit of analysis. If that seems a little weird, hold that thought until we get to the social network analysis unit, and we'll unpack that a little bit further. An example might help. Let's think, for example, about healthcare. I work in healthcare outside of teaching this class, so that's something that's usually on my brain a lot. So if we were to want to do a study on healthcare, what unit of analysis might we work with? Well, we could work with individuals as the unit of analysis. Maybe we're interested in patient experiences, or maybe we're interested in something about doctors or healthcare practitioners. Those are all individual level units of analysis. We could also think about organizations as a unit of analysis. Maybe we're interested in a health plan and how health plans operate. Maybe we're interested in doctor's offices or other kinds of clinics and medical practices. Maybe we're interested in hospitals. Those are all distinct organizational level units of analysis. Or we could take an alternative form of understanding organization and we could compare states or even nations. And it might even be possible to do what's called rolling up to a higher level of unit of analysis if you have the right data to do so. Let's say, for instance, we have a data set on patients, and we also know within that data set what health plan each patient has. We could do an analysis at the patient level, or we could roll that up to the health plan level and do an analysis of health plans. There are many different reasons we might want to do one or the other, or maybe even do some interplay between the two, but the point is you need to be very clear about what your unit of analysis is. None of these are a particularly right or wrong answer. The rightness or wrongness of your unit of analysis really depends on the kind of question you're asking, and to some degree the kinds of data that you're able to access. But you want to make sure that you're being consistent about what you're using and that you have a good rationale for why you use whichever level you decide to use. Along with thinking about our units of analysis, we also need to think about our population of interest. Our population of interest is the full aggregation of the elements of a study, and we usually understand this theoretically. You might think of it as, what are the complete boundaries of the phenomenon that you want to study? And this could be understood at the individual, group, organizational level. Any unit of analysis can fit here. But the point is, we have to take care to specify what exactly our population consists of. So, for instance, are we interested in all patients? All patients in the United States? All patients in Tennessee? All patients in the United States with employer-provided health insurance? Notice how each of these things gives us something slightly different. And one is not necessarily better or worse than another. It really depends on the kind of research question we're asking. But we do need to be very clear about what we mean. Because if we're trying to talk about, say, all patients, but we're really only pulling from all patients in the US, we might need to interrogate that a little bit and figure out, is there a way that we can better link that? Or here's another example. Are we interested in a study on all women, or all women of childbearing years currently in the United States? Again, one is not better or worse than another. We might need that level of specificity in the second one if we're doing something that relates to those other characteristics, such as childbearing or things of that nature. But maybe that's not the key focus of our study, and we're interested in stuff that impacts women broadly. There are different reasons to make different choices. The point in all of this is we need to be very clear about what those choices are that we're making and why we are making them. This leads us to thinking about another key distinction here. I said a moment ago that our population of interest is usually understood theoretically. We also need to think about our study population. Our study population is the population from which our sample is actually drawn. And sometimes this might be a little bit different than the population of interest, whether that be because of access, resources, or a host of other things. And that doesn't necessarily mean that our study is flawed if these things don't line up. It just means we need to think very carefully about what the linkages are and if there are possible limitations. Here's an example. Let's say we're interested in saying something about secondary schools across the United States. But of course, to survey all high schools across the entire United States, that would be quite a task. Let's say that somehow we have managed to access survey data on high schools from Tennessee, Ohio, Massachusetts, Louisiana, and Oregon. So our population of interest might be all secondary schools in the United States, but our study population is actually secondary schools in those 5 states I just listed. Does that mean that we're not actually speaking to the entire US? I think a case could be made that we are, because we have 5 states that are both geographically and politically and culturally pretty diverse. So we're probably doing all right there, but it's still something we need to think very carefully about depending on what kind of research question we have. Here's one more example. Let's say we are interested in environmental attitudes among traditionally college-age students. But what we have are survey data from the student population at Tennessee Tech University. Does that mean that we can't speak to all U.S. college students if we only have one school? Maybe, maybe not. It does mean there might be some caveats we want to think about how region and institution matters. But at the same time, there are also arguments to be made for this could be a reasonable stand-in. So we have a population of interest, we have a study population. They're not exactly the same, but they're linked to one another. How we understand that link is what I'm trying to get at here. Which brings us to the next term we need to define. And you've heard me bounce this around a bit already, and that is sample. A sample is a subset of a given population actually used in a study. Usually, we cannot get information on every single person or entity that might be in our population, even our study population. It often just is not possible. So we have to pull a sample. We have to pull some kind of a subset. And that subset is what we actually focus our study on. Now, there are lots of different ways that we can take a sample. In quantitative work, we generally want our sample to be randomly drawn from the population at large. And if we do so and do it correctly, this is called a random sample or sometimes a probability sample. In a probability sample, regardless of the technique that we use, what we are effectively saying is that everyone in our sample had an even chance of being drawn from the population at large, and therefore any error we might find in how we measure things off of this sample is due simply to random chance. It's not something systematic about how the sample was drawn. Now, as I said, there are many different ways you can do this, from simple random sampling to stratified sampling and all sorts of stuff in between. And if you want to know more about that, your textbook talks about that in greater detail. So check out the chapters that I've assigned for this unit. Now, sometimes, especially in qualitative research, we don't always know the full boundaries of the population that we might want to be speaking about, and so it's hard to do a random sample in those situations. In fact, sometimes it's impossible to do a proper probability sample in those situations. That doesn't mean that non-probability approaches are wrong. It just means that we need to think carefully about the times we might use them. And though we're not going to be doing that in this class, I do want you to be aware of what that looks like. So if you were someday to be on a qualitative project and you were needing to think a bit about sampling, there are again different ways you could do a non-probability sample. Let me start with what you don't want to do. Do not do what is called a convenience sample. A convenience sample is where you basically find any warm body and have them fill out your survey, answer your questions, or whatever it may be. These are notoriously biased, notoriously prone to error, and also incredibly prone to manipulation. An example of convenience sampling in the modern day might be internet polls. We might think, oh, an internet poll, it's a great way to get a lot of people, and it sort of can be depending on how it's administered and distributed. But a lot of internet polls suffer from certain problems. They are taken only by those who actually find the feed or tweet or website or whatever it is that it got posted to, and those who actually took the time to fill it out. So there's some problems in being able to interpret the data there. So convenience sample is a subset of non-probability sample, and it is a very bad approach. Now, there are good examples of non-probability samples. One of those is what's called respondent-driven sampling, also known as a snowball approach. In a respondent-driven sampling technique, usually these are really good for hard-to-reach populations or very rare phenomena or things of that nature. You find one or two people who are related to whatever your topic of interest is, and at the end of typically an interview with them, you ask them to recommend other people who might fit for your study. And so you very slowly start to snowball outward. And if you continue to ask this of everyone you work with, eventually you end up with a pretty decent sample. Obviously there are limitations there. If there is some subset of your population that you're not able to access for not having a social connection, you might be missing out. But on the whole, these have been shown to be very useful ways of studying hard-to-reach populations. Another example is what's called purposive sampling, purposive being a derivative of the word purpose or purposeful. Usually this requires having someone who has an insider knowledge of the phenomenon of interest, quite often the researcher, who is able to very carefully select who or what they would want to sample in order to build a proper case for whatever they're studying. We're not going to go into much more detail than that. I just want you to be aware that there are different kinds of sampling out there. We are going to be focusing on probability sampling, but there are forms of non-probability sampling that are also quite valid depending upon the study being done.